As you can tell by the title there, I'm going to talk about the Chinese debate on the decline of the United States in the 2000s. I'll give a little on both sides of the debate, which actually has pretty deeper roots in history. And I'm focusing on, when I'm talking about a debate, elites in Chinese society, academic elites, people working for government, for think tanks, even people who are in, like, the foreign ministry, for example, or business people, as opposed to Pete, who was talking about broader populations, just so we clarify that. And the key points I'm going to make then center on, first, noting that post-1949 Chinese international relations, IR writing, has always insisted that the U.S. would eventually decline. But the predictions became more confident and bold during the 1990s. We could speculate as to why. I mean, the CCP survived two huge crises in 1989 to 1991, Tiananmen Uprising, collapse of the Soviet Union, of course. They came out of that, the Soviet Union, their three-decade nemesis. And then the rise of China began as a practical fact on the ground, undeniable, and people started talking about it worldwide. This is bound to probably increase the self-confidence of China and patch into this deep-rooted story that China will inevitably recenter in world history and human affairs. And the United States, the only real obstacle to that, is bound, at least in relative terms, to falter and decline. Maybe not in absolute terms, but in relative terms, it has to happen. So that by the 2000s, people in the Chinese international relations world, and these are mostly the people I'm looking at for this, at least this part of this book chapter, because they, including those in the People's Liberation Army, are more responsible for foreign and security policy than, like, economists and others would be. And so I'm interested in foreign U.S. China relations in that angle. But I'll have a chance to mention economists and other non-IR social scientists because they think differently, a lot of them do. And of course, not everyone in the IR world thinks this way. But by the 2000s, people in that world have become so conditioned to expect America's decline that you realize when reading what they're writing and talking to them in interviews, they started to find signs of the U.S.'s imminent decline everywhere. Well, that must be because you're trained to expect this, right? So sure enough, you start finding confirming evidence that it's about to happen. So, as I just suggested, certainly there's all kinds of people outside of that particular social science who thought differently. But in IR itself, eager anticipation. It would be a happy day for most of the people writing in this area. Eager anticipation of U.S. faltering and failing permeated Chinese IR writing. And so then I think you can see where this is headed. After 2008, the conjunction of the U.S. debacle in Iraq with the global financial crisis, with also the artificial sort of surface Chinese success in avoiding that crisis, actually, of course, they were just postponing the problems, led to a profusion of journal articles and books or book chapters in those years since, declaring that the decline had now at last finally begun in earnest. It's a triumphalism, somewhat comparable to the end of history Fukuyamaist triumphalism that gripped the United States in the early 90s, but also different. And I think it's been a key factor, and I'm not alone in suggesting this, encouraging the new assertiveness in Chinese foreign and security policy after 2008, which was a real shift from the 1996 to 2008 period. And because from 1992 to 96, they also had a really assertive policy, and they alienated a lot of their neighbors. They realized this, decided in the fall of 96, let's start being nice. Let's start emphasizing that our rise will be peaceful, that we want to build a harmonious world. And they did this fairly consistently, not to everyone's pleasure, but pretty consistently all the way through 2008, and then suddenly you start to see this shift to the new assertiveness. And so I think the change in discourse is related to that, the slight shift in it. And what's more, the conjunction of America's decline with China's rise is presented as being of almost cosmic moral significance. Not just presented as a social science fact, but you can tell when you read or talk to people, they consider this to be an unalloyed good for the human race, for the future of the human race, and even for the world's flora and fauna, because the West is consistently claimed to be the root source of all the major environmental problems the world faces. I mean, I'm serious about this. You see, it's not just a fact being presented about it, it's a great moral story that will end in China victoriously being recentered in world history. Yet ironically, or even poignantly, just as countless Chinese IR scholars were celebrating after 2008 the U.S. decline, really in earnest, China's own economists and demographers overwhelmingly were warning that, even urgently, that the PRC is facing huge new challenges in those areas. And actually, these warnings predate the GFC. They go back to the mid-2000s or so. I don't have time to talk about all of that. That's a whole bunch of other reading that I had to do today, but trust me, there's a gulf that develops between the hyper-optimism of the IR, of most people, but not all in the IR crowd, and the economists and the people who are advising the state on economic policy, that actually we're not as strong as we appear right now, and after the population starts shrinking, in another 10 years or so, we're gonna be even less strong. We better think about that. The IR people don't want to hear it. 'Cause both in their writings, their published writings, and during interviews, it's pretty clear they either don't read that, or they read it but ignore it and somehow dismiss it. I mean, I've been in interviews where I say, what about so-and-so demographer predicts this? Foreigners just have a hard time understanding China. Literally with a wave of their hand, they would dismiss some of these. I'd say, but I'm talking about Chinese writers and so on. Don't worry about it, it won't be a problem. Just casually brushing it aside. So there's a real hyper optimism about this, and I think it's taken really deep roots since 2008. Now, those brave few who argue, the minority who do take those writings seriously, those brave few argue both that the U.S. isn't necessarily declining and that China's rise isn't inevitable because of these economic, environmental, and demographic problems. And consequently, they portray this new assertive foreign policy as potentially a grave mistake. Okay, so this is not just an academic debate. It happened, it's unfolding even now, right as the newly assertive foreign policy began and continues. Or some say it might be in temporary eclipse, but I think the jury's probably still out on that. So, just really quickly, a few examples of how influential people in the early 2000s were planting the seeds in the minds of Chinese younger scholars to expect this. Wang Yi of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs saying in June 2000, multipolarization, which means the rise of China basically and the decline of the US in relative terms, and international democratization, which means the US will stop interfering in China's and other countries' internal affairs. They jointly constitute an inevitable trend and irreversible historical process. Oh, that's strong terminology, right? If it's been hammered into your head, it's no surprise you'd start seeing signs of that starting to happen everywhere. Wang Jisi from Peking University, his name came up this morning. July 2002, he declares the decline of the US is inevitable. Only the timing, process, and nature of the decline are difficult to predict. And I'll have a little bit more to say about Professor Wang in a bit. And then last, Zhang Chenjun of Beijing Normal University and American Studies Quarterly, a really important journal of American studies. And this is pretty prescient too, right? It's fall 2003. The US will face a structural crisis after the Iraq War, both because the war will inevitably fail and because the unilateralism expressed in that war, bypassing the UN, not only for that, but for the Kosovo intervention, all of that violates international law, and international law is integrally tied into the moral order of the universe. And so once states driving for global hegemony start doing those kind of things, they'll inevitably come to a no good end. Let me briefly illustrate a little bit more detail by talking about multipolarization, which again, it means international relations realist scholars say all the world prior to 1945 was multipolar. You had about 5 great powers. From 1945 to 1991 or 2, it was bipolar. And then since then, first it was kind of unipolar, and then maybe, we don't know what it's going to do. Chinese scholars since the 80s have insisted unipolarity and even bipolarity are unnatural. Multipolarity or multipolarization is the inevitable natural trend. But when you read closely, what they seem to really mean is that China will rise, the US will decline. Okay, so here's a person with the People's Liberation Army Press publishing a book in 2006 on the multipolar world. He says China's rise will surely be rocky because the US will try to suppress it, but in the end, the US will be defeated and China will help to usher in a brand new epoch of world peace. Because China's rise isn't just about China improving its material condition and being able to influence more people, it has great moral significance. So it'll accompany the rise of China, the progress of the human race and society. China is a progressive country, and its rise is inherently progressive. And correspondingly, the relative decline of the U.S. is inherently progressive and good for all of the human race. Certainly there'll be hegemonists, terrorists, secessionists, splitists, and all those kind of folks who will keep putting obstacles in the way and so on, but eventually they're doomed to defeat. Okay, now, more recent illustrations of this thinking after 2008. Okay, so you can see what happened. So Yin Changda is with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs think tank, a think tank under the ministry, the China Institute of International Studies. In March 2011, says straightforwardly that the GFC sped the trend of multipolarization, which is now developing to an unprecedented degree. So he's not reading the economists and the demographers. He's got this triumphalism. It's really pregnant in that article that seems to drive his attention away from any possibility that something could go wrong. And he identifies 3 ways in which the GFC did speed America's decline, although he doesn't provide sources for the data. I don't have time, actually. I'm getting a clock here. Basically, the role of the U.S. and the portion of global GDP produced by the U.S. declined over that decade of the 2000s. So America's role as the chief engine of the world economy is now a thing in the past, and it suffered mightily as a result of the Iraq War in terms of soft power. Now, whereas China, at the same time, he claims, improved its soft power. But we know from the Pew poll that came out last summer and other polls, actually China's soft power, its favorability image in other countries, multiple other countries, has steadily declined for the last 5 years. And since Obama became president, the U.S. has gone back up. All right, another I'll just take a quick detour to demonstrate the new assertiveness in foreign policy after 2008. And some have called it into question, not here so much as in some famous IR journals, some asking the question, how new is it, how assertive is it? Most people, I think, who are specialists on China certainly perceived it. Sam Jia of University of Denver talking about incidents where Chinese naval vessels harassed U.S. vessels which had long sailed through the South China Sea. Pete and I attended a conference at SMU where a retired admiral gave some other examples of that. Carl Thayer, a Southeast Asia specialist from Australia and a retired diplomat, expressly identifying 2009 as a key turning point year because the South China Sea emerged as a regional hotspot thanks to China's increasing assertiveness. China's own foreign minister, probably heard this story before, at the acrimonious ASEAN Regional Forum in July 2010. The subject was the South China Sea. He was getting pushback from smaller countries like Singapore, Philippines, with Secretary of State Clinton there. So he angrily and icily looked the Singaporean representative in the eye and said, China is a big country and other countries are small countries, and that's a fact. Okay. September 2010, we've talked about, I think, these issues, the collision between the Chinese fishing vessel, which twice rammed Japanese Coast Guard vessels. Not only did China not apologize or offer to compensate for the damage, but it demanded an apology from Japan. In return, spring 2012, the U.S. brokers this deal quietly behind the scenes for both China and the Philippines to pull back from a place called Scarborough Shoal, a set of rocks that they contest in the South China Sea. Both sides, Philippines and China, said, yeah, we'll do that, because that'll reduce tensions. So China pulls back, Philippines pulls back, and then China goes right back at it. And it's been there ever since. Basically, it controls Scarborough Shoal. Reneged on the deal. July 2012. The ROC establishes, upgrades this tiny town on Yongxing Island in the Paracels of Sansha, and from a county administrative office to a prefecture with formal responsibility for administering all the land and water features claimed by China in the South China Sea. There you see the Paracels, which of course China seized from South Vietnamese forces in January 1974. That's where Yongxing Island is, the capital now of the South China Sea. And there's the glorious and celebratory opening of the new government building there. See. All right, and finally, senior China foreign and security policy analyst Michael Swain offered a cogent summary of this new tough Chinese approach. And Michael Swain, if you know Michael, is not one to cast aspersions on China unless the evidence is overwhelming. And he says, he interviewed a lot of people, many Chinese observers not only recognize that the Chinese government is becoming more influential and assertive, but regard such a development as entirely unsurprising, entailing China's marching to the center of the world stage. So there are some Chinese IR dissenters from this new hubris. And I'm going to just speed up here and give you one or two examples. Wang Jisi, told you I'd bring him back. He, in the course of an ongoing debate over the continued relevance of Deng Xiaoping's famous injunction in 1989 to 90, China should keep a low profile in international affairs, Wang Jisi says, yes, we should, because this stuff we're doing in the South China Sea, it's risky and dangerous. And he makes several points in support of this. He says, first of all, not only is China about to surpass the United States in comprehensive national power, it's not, he hasn't even actually passed Japan yet. Yeah, in GDP it surpassed Japan a couple of years ago. But in terms of soft power, whether it's educational attainments, scientific attainments, degree of national unity, the ability for them to maintain a healthy democratic system for 2 decades during which the economy has been in a morass is very impressive to Wang Jisi. China is also stuck in an interesting geopolitical predicament. It's the center of this new Asian economic order, but not the center of the security order there. The U.S. hub and spoke model still is the primary architecture along with ASEAN. And China also has a lot of enemies, or at least opponents, over territorial disputes and so on. And then finally, China is alone, isolated in the world ideologically. What inspiring visions for the future of politics can China possibly provide? Professor Wang asked. I don't have time to talk about Yang Jianmian of the Shanghai Institute of International Studies, but he doesn't like the pivot because he thinks the United States has declined somewhat in relative terms and so should be more respectful of China's desires and demands. But the main thrust of his article is to enumerate all the lingering strengths of the United States, which you already know, so I won't have to go over them. He recognizes those, and he's warning. The warning here is don't get ahead of the game. Deng Xiaoping's injunction is still important. This new policy line since 2009 has grave risks entailed. So, summary. Just to repeat, the many years spent cultivating expectations of America's inevitable decline relative to China have led countless specialists in the Chinese IR community to conclude in the aftermath of the Iraq War and the global financial crisis that the U.S. decline has finally begun in earnest. Too often these conclusions seemed rooted in an almost astrological research method, right? They were expecting this, and then the signs, it didn't entail necessarily a scientific examination of the facts, unlike the economists were engaging in, and they don't think that the U.S. is declining, and they know the U.S. has troubles. They certainly don't think China's on the verge of surpassing the U.S. unless it makes big changes. So the demographers and economists and so on call the new triumphalism unjustified, the new assertiveness extremely risky. Okay, they don't like it, and they're warning their comrades about it. Any serious and sustained Chinese economic slowdown, which of course many now consider unavoidable, could eventually deflate this triumphalism. But who and when in 2012 pumped up the economy again, by issuing a lot of new credit in the months before they handed over power to try to create an artificial environment of harmony, I think. But actually, so did Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang in the past few months. I mean, the expansion of new credit was more in the last few months than previous. So they haven't really embarked upon those reforms yet. But every time they do that, and it feels like, wow, prices are still rising for all the 3 homes I own. How could this not be true? This narrative that the United States is about to decline and that we're rising. It reinforces it rather, and the China Dream discourse also. That slogan also reinforces it. And so would arguably, I think, and even Wang Jisi criticizes the term China Dream, but he was writing in 2011 before Xi Jinping co-opted it, so probably not too dangerous for him. So last point, when this slowdown occurs, many in the Chinese IR world, including in the People's Liberation Army, which is very important in foreign and security policy, will be bitterly disappointed. They and the nationalists Pete talked about and the general public would also be bitterly disappointed. They'll have to somehow adjust to the frustration of their ecstatic expectations, and the resulting emotional dissatisfaction. Political difficulties will not be easy for the Chinese Communist Party to manage. I see the time is up, so I'll move along.